Amy, Dan, Zach, and Lauren often travel together, have fun, and capture their adventures. After Dan has a bit too much to drink, he clumsily moves around with his camera, loses balance, and falls from a hilltop, getting minor injuries. After 5 years, he reunites with his worried friends. Amy, her husband James, and their daughter Sarah travel to Mexico City to join Zach's 30th birthday celebration on Dan's new yacht, the Midway. Zach and Lauren zoom past them on a motorbike, and they all meet up at the yacht club where Dan's luxurious boat is docked. Amy is the only one wearing a life vest and shows caution as she nears the yacht. She's always been afraid of water since her father tragically drowned on a sailing expedition. With support from her husband, she faces her fear. Amy bravely confronts her fear and steps onto the yacht's deck. As they explore, they stumble upon Dan and his new love interest, Michelle, cozying up in the cabin. They raise the sails and embark on their journey. Zach and Lauren question Dan about how he could afford such an extravagant vessel, but he just laughs it off and avoids the question. Amy and James tuck their daughter in and set up a walkie-talkie to keep an eye on her as the party heats up. Their friends drink, dance, and have fun. Michelle suggests they go for a swim to cool off, which everyone eagerly agrees to, except for Amy, who stays on board with Dan. Amy and Dan go down to check on Sarah, during which Dan expresses regret over his past mistakes and his desire for children. Amy, content with their life, smoothly changes the subject and encourages Dan to return to the deck. While the rest of the group enjoys their time swimming in the ocean, Zach dives down and finds a seashell resting on the seabed. He retrieves it and decides to gift it to Lauren as a souvenir of their adventure. Meanwhile, on the yacht's deck, Michelle engages in playful banter with James, Amy's husband. Their conversation seems to have a flirtatious undertone. Back on the deck, Amy shares her worries with Dan about her fear of the water. She's anxious that her fear might impact their daughter Sarah, who is on board the yacht. Despite Amy's apprehension, Dan unexpectedly scoops her up and jumps into the sea. This sudden action shocks Amy, triggering a panic attack as traumatic memories of her father's drowning come rushing back. As Amy begins to panic, her friends attempt to calm her down. However, their efforts seem futile as Amy becomes increasingly overwhelmed by her fear. To make matters worse, they realize that Dan forgot to lower the ladder before jumping into the water. This oversight leaves them stranded in the ocean, with only Sarah remaining on board, surrounded by the vast expanse of water. In an attempt to soothe Amy's nerves, James gently sings a lullaby to her while the others struggle to figure out a way to get back onto the yacht. They try to push themselves up from the water's surface to reach the deck, but find it challenging without a ladder. Despite their efforts, the walls of the ship were too high for them to climb over. Michelle, feeling increasingly terrified, clung to an inflatable dolphin for safety, but her exhaustion was becoming apparent. Dan devised a plan to use the inflatable dolphin to help them climb back onto the ship. However, his attempts were in vain, as the dolphin was too slippery and promptly deflated under his weight. Seeing a flag on the ship's stern, Dan tried to reach it, but it took him 3 tries before he managed to secure it. However, the flag turned out to be too flimsy to support Dan's weight. Once they regained their composure, there was a brief moment of silence as they contemplated their next move. However, Michelle's hysterics over a perceived shark disrupted the moment. Despite Dan's investigation revealing no sign of a shark, the looming danger was evident to all. As frustration mounted, blame was directed at Dan for their current predicament. Despite him acknowledging his poor judgment, they struggled to find a solution. Through her tears, Amy stressed the urgency of their situation, especially for Sarah, who was alone on the ship. Michelle's mental state continued to deteriorate, driven by exhaustion-induced hysteria, leading her to attempt to rip away Amy's life jacket. The group worked together to keep Amy safe, and Michelle's distressed state was temporarily calmed by Lauren's prayer. As they remained stranded under the relentless sun, their energy levels dropped unusually low, and thirst began to set in. Suddenly, a mobile phone's ring broke the silence, vibrating from within Zach's swaying coat. Dan swiftly discarded it, and Zach answered the call. However, the phone is drenched, and before they can relay any urgent message, it cuts out. Overwhelmed, Michelle snatches the device from Zach, accidentally dropping it into the water, cutting off any chance for further communication. Dan then proposes a new rescue plan, to strip off their possessions and tie them together with a rope to toss onto the ship. In the midst of this, they catch sight of another vessel speeding nearby. Past them, the group frantically tries to gain the attention of the passengers on the passing vessel. However, their distress signals are misunderstood as friendly waves, leaving them no choice but to return to Dan's plan. Using a knife found in Zach's coat, they shred the clothing to create a rope. James questions Dan about the feasibility of reaching the ship from below, but even Dan himself isn't sure. After inspecting the situation, Dan grabs the knife and takes a dive. As they manage to get the makeshift rope onto the ship, Zach tries to use it to climb aboard, only for it to snap, causing Zach to tumble back into the water. James's attempts are similarly fruitless as he tries to retrieve the dropped knife. Diving too deep, James hits his head against the vessel as he resurfaces. When James emerges from the water, Lauren discovers a bleeding ear, indicating a head injury that requires immediate medical attention. This incident convinces Zach to adopt a much more radical approach to rescue. He takes a knife from James and begins to forcefully penetrate the side of the ship. Dan panics, fearing the damage Zach may cause to the vessel, and a frantic struggle ensues between them. Tragically, in the chaos, Zach is accidentally stabbed in the abdomen by Dan. Chaos erupts as Sarah's desperate cries are heard over the radio. She has just woken up and can't find her parents. Zach's severe injury, without access to medical care, leads to a slow and agonizing death. Michelle, exhausted and weakened, separates from the group and collapses. Despite Dan's efforts, he is unable to save her. Amidst the turmoil, he tries to maintain a sense of humor. Zach reminisces about a past adventure, lamenting Dan's forgotten camera. His final memory is a vivid recall of Lauren's dazzling beauty. Lauren is left clutching Zach's lifeless body, overcome with uncontrollable sobs. James, on the brink of anger, blames Dan for their current ordeal, accusing him of valuing material possessions over human lives. Amy tries to calm James down, but her defense of Dan only further infuriates him. His frustration leads to physical exertion and inducing vomiting. In a moment of honesty, Dan confesses to fabricating tales about the yacht and his wealth. In reality, he borrowed the yacht from his employer, where he worked doing menial tasks. His aim was to impress women like Michelle and portray a glamorous life to his friends, hiding his lack of real accomplishments. In the face of his best friend's death, Dan's previous refusal to damage the yacht with a knife now feels irrelevant. This realization breaks him down, and he bursts into tears. Lauren confesses to holding romantic feelings towards Zach, which she had never expressed. Amy persuades her to let go of Zach's body. As hours pass on the open sea, the group, physically drained, maintains their composure and reflects on their personal experiences. James's physical condition deteriorates, causing him to rave aimlessly. A desperate Lauren bids farewell to her friends and takes a chance at swimming to shore for help. Despite Amy's attempts to console her over the radio, little Sarah's persistent crying continues. Amy recalls Zach's idea about boarding with the help of knives and decides to act on it. She dives into the water to retrieve the lost knife while in the water. Driven by guilt and a desire to mend matters with his comrades, Dan decides to venture beneath the waves. As evening engulfs them, Amy remains floating atop the sea, accompanied only by James, who frequently loses consciousness, only to awaken and confess to Amy how exhausted he feels and the vigorous headache he suffers from. As rain begins to drizzle, James quietly breathes his last. Amy cries out, devastated by the loss of her beloved. Dan hears her painful screams, but he must maintain his search, diving and resurfacing continuously to retrieve a much-needed knife. As the night unfolds, Amy confronts the reality of James's passing. She tenderly releases his lifeless form into the dark waters, bidding him farewell with the melody of their daughter's lullaby, a poignant moment filled with sorrow and acceptance. Emerging from the water, Dan is racked with intense pain in his arm, a sharp reminder of the perilous situation they find themselves in. Amy, despite their own precarious circumstances, selflessly offers her life vest to Dan, aiding him in his struggle to reach the safety of their boat amidst the raging storm, their collective survival hanging in the balance. A sense of despair overwhelms Dan as he grapples with the harsh realities of their predicament. In a surge of frustration and anguish, he impulsively smashes his goggles against the stern of the boat, his injured hand bearing testament to the emotional and physical toll of their harrowing ordeal. However, a glimmer of ingenuity sparks within Dan as he considers how the shard might be repurposed. Clutching the sharp fragment tightly, he wedges it between a wooden plank and the movable passageway, creating a makeshift handhold to maintain his grip. Seeing Dan's resourcefulness, Amy is spurred into action. Using Dan's hand as a stabilizing point, she summons her strength to mount his hand, struggling against the lashing rain and turbulent waves as she tries to climb aboard the ship. But the slippery conditions cause her grip to falter, sending her plunging back into the churning water. Undeterred, Dan's encouraging words echo through the storm, urging Amy to persevere. Drawing upon their shared determination, Amy clambers atop Dan's shoulders, ready to make another valiant attempt to reach safety. Despite the searing pain from the jagged glass, Dan grits his teeth and bears it, his screams echoing through the tumultuous night each time Amy inadvertently steps on his injured arm. Despite the setbacks, Amy refuses to yield, summoning her resolve after each fall, gathering her strength for another ascent. With sheer determination, Amy persists, her efforts finally rewarded as she secures a firm grip on the ship's side, hauling herself onto the safety of the deck. Overwhelmed by a flood of relief and joy, Dan unleashes a triumphant roar, his voice cutting through the storm. Without hesitation, Amy rushes to lower the passageway, her heart racing with the urgency to comfort their daughter waiting within the sanctuary of the boat's cabin. In the embrace of safety, their family finds solace amidst the chaos of the tempestuous night. Dan clings to the ascending passageway, a moment of hesitation seizing him as he weighs his options. Should he follow Amy, seeking safety for himself, or confront the consequences of his past actions? Meanwhile, Amy, cradling young Sarah in her arms, extends comfort to her daughter, grateful that their ordeal seems to be drawing to a close. Yet her relief is short-lived as she realizes Dan's absence from their newfound sanctuary. Stepping out onto the deck, Amy's eyes scan the turbulent waters, her heart sinking as she spots a lone life jacket bobbing on the surface. A pang of dread grips her as she glimpses Dan's motionless form in the distance. Desperation sets in as Amy futilely attempts to catch Dan's attention, hurling the life jacket towards him in a desperate bid to aid his salvation. But as realization dawns upon her, she understands that guilt, a weight heavier than any storm, has driven Dan to make his fateful choice. With grim intention, Dan deliberately submerges himself, a haunting echo of Amy's own past trauma, the memory of her father's drowning etched deeply into her consciousness since childhood. Determined to prevent history from repeating itself, Amy summons her courage and dives into the roiling waters to rescue Dan. As Amy descends, struggling against the turbulent currents, fragmented scenes from her past flash before her eyes, memories of her younger self desperately trying to save her father from a similar fate. Meanwhile, as dawn breaks, a fishing vessel approaches the yacht, its crew calling out in search of any signs of life aboard the deserted ship. With no response forthcoming, the fishing boat sails away, leaving Sarah alone on the yacht, her fate uncertain amidst the vast expanse of the sea. In the cabin, Sarah awakens, her cries echoing through the empty space, a poignant reminder of the uncertainty that still looms over their situation. As the narrative draws to a close, Amy emerges on the deck, her gaze sweeping across the boundless expanse of the sea stretched out before her. At her feet, Dan lies unconscious, a testament to Amy's courageous rescue efforts. Despite the absence of the fishing boat and the distant drone of its engines fading into the horizon, Amy remains resolute. She has saved Dan, and though the journey ahead may be fraught with challenges, she is determined to navigate them and find her way back home. With renewed strength and a steadfast spirit, Amy prepares to embark on the voyage homeward, with hope as her compass and resilience as her guide.